Dreamer by Nazem Kadri. I read this earlier this fall. I absolutely loved it. There's all sorts of things in it. And look, I'm not going to give the plot to everything we're about to list here. I want to keep this quick. Nazem Kadri, a unique case, the first Muslim player to ever play in the NHL. How did his family get here? What was that like growing up in London? Two iconic franchises in the OHL that he played for, and not just iconic franchises, but rivals. How did he end up going from the Kitchener Rangers to the London Knights? Fascinating stuff. You all remember the drama that went into the first few years being part of the Leafs organization. He's not shy about telling you who in that Leafs front office he did not get along with. People that he was frankly telling straight up, fuck off. Says he always loved Brian Burke, right? But not everybody underneath Berkey did he get along with. What was it like when he was traded out of Toronto? They tried to ship him off to Calgary. He said no, everything that went into that. Really fascinating look. This is, of course, also the first NHL player who brought the Stanley Cup to a mosque. It's a great story, a great read. And the great thing about it is it's Nas, right? He doesn't pull a punch. He's happy to just talk and tell you what he thinks. Makes for a great read. So that is Dreamer by Nazem Kadri. Derek Whibley's Walking Disaster. Derek Whibley is the lead singer for Sum 41. They are on their farewell tour right now. They're going to wrap that up in Toronto at the end of January, and they've just decided to pull the plug on the band before they go too stale. And look, if you're sitting here going, are they still a thing? Maybe they're already too stale. Maybe. But it is a fantastic story of a group that grew up kind of just outside Toronto and really became one of those bands of the early 2000s, whether they were in your NHL games, whether they were on Edge 102, your alternative radio stations. All these things are super interesting because they're relatable, because they're Canadian. How did they get from this shitty little band playing in, I don't know, community centers around Scarborough to one of the biggest bands in the world for several years? There was, I don't know, like a 5-year period where Sum 41, maybe a little longer than that, had some of the biggest hits in the world. And we heard earlier this fall part of a story that's really uncomfortable. I don't know how deep I should go into it here because it's better told in the book. But this relationship that Derek had as a teenager with the lead singer of Treble Charger, who he thought was looking out for them and looking out for their band. But it turns out he's a bit of a predator and everything that went into that. Of course, Derek Whibley would go on, marry Avril Lavigne, what goes into, that relationship and then the breakup of it. He's right there with Paris Hilton as her sex tape. Look, if you're somebody who grows up at about my age, this is one of those bands you relate to, and there are stories to be told. Nahlah Ayed, The War We Want Apart. And this sort of is one of those books where I get into more, I don't know if it's nerdy or not. I wouldn't shy away from it if that's what you wanted to call it. But there's some military history. I was joking around not too long ago with my brother-in-law. It's a meme I saw somewhere else that said, when you kind of hit 40 years old, you get big into military history or you get big into woodworking. Those are your choices. That's it. That's all you got. And I ended up getting into the military history side of things. I always liked the Hardcore History podcast. My YouTube feed is littered with stuff from World War II and whatever else. But this is a story, a true story, written by Nahlah Ayed. If you recognize that name, it's because for a long time she was a reporter for the CBC. And this is I don't know, I guess if you wanted to, call it a love story. But it's some guy who's born in Quebec, and he makes his way through the most secret parts of the Allied military to become part of this group that is going to be dropped in behind the German front lines in France to try to prepare for D-Day, to help arm the French resistance and the revolution that are going to rise up and help the Allies from behind enemy lines. And while he's being educated in England, he meets this woman, and they're like 20 and 18 or 21 and 19, whatever it might be, very young. And they fall in love while being educated to go and do this group, while being trained, right, to go and do this mission they fall in love and they get married, and like a week and a half after they get married, they're separated because they're not going to send these people off together. You're here to do a job. We're not here to, take care of your marriage, make sure you get off on the right foot. And they end up separated. And they are arming the resistance in France in World War II, but separated. And at the end of the war, they end up reuniting, and she comes home to Canada as a war bride. She was not Canadian originally. Like I said, they meet in England. It's a fantastic story. And am I much for big romantic stories? Not really, but that's not really what this is. It's more the crazy coincidence that these people managed to meet each other, fall in love, be shipped off, both survive the war behind Nazi lines in France, and then survive and reunite and come home to Canada. Really good story by Nahlah Ayed. This next one I know is one I mentioned a couple of months ago on the podcast. Alan Shipnuck is the author. It's called Live and Let Die, but it's kind of clever. It's not Live and Let Die. It's LIV, right? 54, the golf tour, and Let Die. And it's the whole story that goes into creating this alternate golf tour. And I am not, as you guys know, a golf guy, but this story is fascinating. The Saudis, how it gets funded, the political ties to it, the PGA pushback, the guys who all said, I'll never leave the PGA, before, of course, getting up and taking off with no apologies, no whatever. And then the abuse that the guys who join Live take before the PGA partners up with them anyway. And now these guys are like, well, my reputation is taking this beating, and you were just going to end up partnering with them in the end. It's really interesting. There's political intrigue. There is obviously financial stuff that goes into this. There always is. It's been a while since we've seen, I don't know, like somebody rise up and rival the NFL like we saw in the 80s with the USFL. When we saw the WHA rise up against the NHL. And we've seen these things in the past, but it's been a long time. And Live Golf was that. We had a good time around here on the show calling it the Bonesaw Open. Not particularly sensitive, but, that's what we called it. This was a great read, whether you're a golf person or not. If you're just sort of into sports business or the political intrigue that can leak into sports, this is a really easy read. Home and Away, I think I mentioned a little while ago. This is the book that came out in October by Matt Sundin. And I'll be honest with you, like if you're a Leaf fan, this is an easy read. If you're a Matt Sundin fan, this is an easy read. But if you're a non-Leaf fan, I don't know. There's not a ton here. But if you are into that kind of thing, this works. This tells a nice story of growing up in Sweden, not understanding what the NHL is while you're being drafted first overall, ending up in Quebec. I assumed I was going to North America, and yet here's a little corner of it I didn't think I'd be going to. Now I got to learn French, everything that goes into that. Gets traded to the Leafs for Wendell Clark. How do I replace a legend in that market and the hardships that went into that? His battles with Pat Quinn. If you think about times like 99, 2000, when the Leafs are, I guess it's a little later than that, battling with the Devils, Pat Quinn used to keep Sundin off the ice when Bobby Holik was out there. That was the whole point. So the Devils would just play the shit out of Bobby Holik and leave Matt Sundin. And they had arguments, Sundin and Pat Quinn, about, you got to put me out there. You got to let me try against this guy. Like, it was interesting to hear him talk about the battles he had within the Leaf franchise. And later on, when we all remember Leaf fans wanting him to leave, wanting him to waive his no trade clause and go. And he says no, only later on that year to go sign with Vancouver, and the Leafs get nothing for him. That was botched by the Leafs, botched by him, but his perspective on the story was pretty interesting. War by Bob Woodward. Bob Woodward is a guy who has written books on every American president, often two per term, going all the way back to the Watergate scandal. This one I throw on here because I find it really interesting. He'd written a couple in the past during the Donald Trump presidency that were sort of as scandalous as you thought they would be, because Donald Trump is a scandalous guy. He's not an honest guy. He doesn't run a clean ship. It brought out some info you didn't know, but the picture that was painted of that White House was exactly what you thought it would be. This one is about Joe Biden's term, and this is while he's trying to balance what's going on in Ukraine with the Russia invasion and how far he's willing to allow the United States to go to protect Ukraine. At the same time, we see Israel just shelling Palestine and Gaza, and how he was trying to balance that at the same time, while also preparing for Donald Trump and a re-election, and how at the end of the day, Joe Biden ends up stepping aside for Kamala Harris and everything that went into that, the people that were pressuring him, right? So it's all politics, but it's an interesting read. And this is one of those books that people get pissed off about because Bob Woodward reveals some stuff here that would have been really good to know long before the election. Would have been really good to know 6 months, 12 months, 18 months ago about the world we were all facing. And he has the information. He knows, but he's saving it for his book so that he can release a passage or two before it gets sold and make people go, oh man, I better buy that. Well, are you a journalist at that point? Because your job as a journalist is to, you know what I'm saying? Like, is to reveal this information at a time where it can be usable to the public. Or are you just a salesman trying to sell your book? It doesn't mean the info isn't true, but it means he held on to it until way too long, way too late, and now it's just being used to sell books. And that's an interesting debate in and of itself. But the book, War, by Bob Woodward, about the later parts of Joe Biden's presidency and everything that went into that, man, I can't say isn't interesting. I don't love the way we got there, but it's a great book. Habs 365 is the last book we're going to recommend here. That's our buddy Mike Comito, and he was on here about a month ago, maybe a little more than that, to talk about it. Look, if you read Hockey 365, the second period, if you read Leafs 365, you already understand the concept here, right? It's a different little story every day for a calendar year of what's gone on. You know, in the first two was about the league. In the next one, it was about the Leafs. This one is all about the Habs. Different stories every day of the year about what the Montreal Canadiens history has been. And I'm not a huge Habs guy, as you guys know. In fact, I kind of can't stand the Habs. But it's a great read. There are stories here I had never seen before. I'd never heard before. And Mike Comito is a fantastic writer, manages to shrink all these little stories down into about a page and a half per day. And we've talked about it before. You can just throw that on the back of the toilet. Enjoy that day's story as you're taking care of business in the morning, and then off you go, or leave it on the coffee table. Look, if you've already left it on the back of the toilet, don't move it to the coffee table. That's not cool. Like, nobody wants that going on. But this is a great book here. All of these linked in the show notes at tallcanaudio.com or wherever you're hearing us.